Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Marc Lamont Hill. I am the owner of Uncle Bobbie's Coffee and Books, and welcome to yet another in our author series. Today, I am taking uh, the pleasure, quite selfishly, of not just hosting an author talk, but hosting an author talk of a book that I co-authored, a book with Mitchell Plitnick. It's called Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics. But what we wanted to do today was not just talk about this book, although we will talk about the book, but to really have a broader conversation, as we always do at Uncle Bobbie's. We don't want to have book infomercials. We want to have community conversations about the issues in the book. And today, one of those issues is the question of Palestine and the American left. And so, who better to have that conversation with than Dima Khalidi? She is Director of Palestine Legal. And of course, Dr. Angela Davis, longtime activist, scholar, and just all things committed to solidarity movements for justice. Mitchell Plitnick is my co-author. He will, of course, speak for himself, but Mitchell is the president of Rethinking Foreign Policy. He's a policy analyst. He's a frequent writer on the Middle East and U.S. foreign policy. He was the co-director of Jewish Voices for Peace. He's worked with B'Tselem. He's an extraordinary person, and quite honestly, it's been a wonderful experience writing the book with him. And so what we want to do today is, what do we want to do today? We want to talk a little bit about the book, why we wrote the book, but again, talk about it in the context of a broader conversation about Palestine and the American left. I'm going to let Mitchell do a lot of talking. I'm just going to say a couple of quick things. And then we'll pass this thing around with some questions. And of course, we'll take questions and answers from all of you. Mitchell and I wrote this book. Mitchell and I first actually met on a delegation to Palestine about 5 years ago. It was sponsored by the Foundation for Middle East Peace, and part of the goal of that delegation was to create solidarity, to connect Black activists, Black journalists, Black writers to the question of Palestine. It wasn't my first trip to Palestine, but it was a very different trip that I took with Mitchell and others that I'm still very, very grateful for. And Mitchell and I developed a relationship. We continued to talk and continued to write, or at least think together, and said, we need to write something. And what did we want to write about? I am not Palestinian. Mitchell is not an Israeli, but we both had deep investment in the questions and the issues for a variety of reasons. And so we said, what we can do as Americans, as American taxpayers, as American citizens, think about the role that American policy has played in the occupation of Palestine, in the deprivation of rights, and so forth and so on. And so we wrote this book, Except for Palestine, sort of playing on that the old activist label of the PEP, the person who is progressive on every issue except for Palestine. And so that's why we use that book title, and that's what we're sort of engaged in. But I want to pass this on to Mitchell. Mitchell, could you just talk a little bit about what some of your big motivations were for writing the book, and then we'll get into some of the Q&A.
Yeah. So, first of all, thanks, Mark, for the gracious words and introduction. And I'm just want to really express how honored I am that at the launch of this book, that we have such esteemed people to help us do that in Dima Khalidi and Dr. Angela Davis. Both of you are heroes of mine, and so I just really want to thank you for being here with us. So. One of the, we bounced around a lot of ideas about this book. What do we want to focus on? I mean, there's so many different aspects, and this particular field has also been kind of saturated with books and articles, and so many different people offering their takes, talking about many of the different aspects of this just horrible injustice that is happening on a day-to-day basis. And the question for me, I think for me personally, I won't speak for Mark, but for me personally, it was really important that this not be perceived as, sort of speaking for Palestinians, presenting a Palestinian, version of history or point of view or any part of that. It was really important that we speak as American observers and speak about the things that we saw as problematic from our people, in our country and our government. there's a lot of things that we can talk about, but I think what's really important is that there is no, in this country, there is no significant political force speaking out for Palestinians. That's not to say that we don't see plenty of people working for justice in Palestine. We see it in the media. Media discourse has changed over the last few years, but I've been working in Washington since 2008, and I can tell you firsthand there just isn't a political impact here, and that's sort of puzzling. There's many issues that we can look at, whether it is, for example, when we talk about sort of major lobbies, right? What's the first thing people think of is the National Rifle Association, the NRA. That's a big deal, and it's a really powerful lobby, and yet they don't just get their way. There's significant opposition within the Democratic Party to them. Well, why is that? That's because there's a significant political force supporting gun control. We in Washington, despite the fact that there is significant, we see it in polls and we see it in just in the common discourse, there is significant support for Palestinian rights, even though that can take many different forms, but there's significant support, but it doesn't translate into Washington. And so I think it was really important for us to come together and come up with something that spoke to that, and that kind of poked people and said, wait a second, you have all these, liberal views or progressive views on so many issues, but when it comes to this one, some people, maintain the same sort of standards, but others seem to find ways to excuse things that we would not excuse in other contexts. And to me, that's unacceptable. It's self-defeating, and it ties in to the frequent sense of apathy or avoidance, maybe, of many liberals on many issues that are domestic issues when they get too hot. And I think this is an issue that's always hot. And so people kind of leave it, to find ways to justify leaving it alone. And that's unacceptable to me. I think it reflects back on our domestic policy. And ultimately, we're all very responsible for a situation that has gone on for decades where people have no rights. Yeah. These are things that should be unacceptable to people who vote liberal or hold liberal values. And somehow there's a significant portion for whom it is acceptable. And I felt like we needed to hold a mirror up to that.
And that's exactly what we do, especially as we enter the era of Biden. When we wrote this book, we were terrified that we'd have 8 years of Trump. And so we wrote the book with obviously Trump in mind. And then we got more hopeful in September, October, and we called the publisher and said, hey, if you just give us a couple of days after the election, we think Biden may win this election. Can we write a preface that includes Joe Biden? And fortunately, we were able to, and we're able to really press out an argument, I think, that forces us to reckon with what this issue means with Biden as president. Because going back to the norm, going back to the status quo, is untenable for so many vulnerable people around the world, and Palestinians are no exception. Dina, let me bring you in as someone who works in this field, and as someone obviously, and as a Palestinian. Why is the issue of Palestine so urgent? Why is it so important?
It's so great to be here with all of you. Can you hear me all right? Yeah, it's something that I think actually forces us to think about the foundations of our own country in so many ways. It forces us to question, as I think the book does, what are our values actually? And when we begin to question those things, it really lays bare the contradictions. Are we a democracy? Do we value, collective freedom, individual freedoms, or are we a place where, money dictates politics, where, might makes right, where, colonization equals, sovereignty and power. So I think that's one of the reasons why it's so hard for this country to really grapple with the idea that, Israel is a settler colonial state, that, it poses the same kinds of questions that are raised when we question the foundation of the United States. But I think one of the reasons why it's so important for people to grapple with this is because it really forces us to decide. It forces us to decide where we stand, not just on Palestine, but it forces us to ask, where is our money going? What does our money do? And I think if we apply it across the board, it brings us back to our domestic politics too. Why are we spending billions and billions of dollars supporting human rights abuses, supporting regime change in Iraq, supporting, dictators everywhere when, our own country faces such immense inequalities and such immense problems? And so, it really lays bare what this country is about, actually. It's about empire. It's about creating a country here that is really built on the exploitation of people and land, and etc. And I think one of the things that the book does is say, like, this is the moment. This is the moment when we have an opening to really start questioning these things. And I think the uprising over the summer is to do that, when it comes to our own priorities. And we have to take advantage of the moment to really continue pushing the shifts that we're going to see when it comes to Palestine, that we can talk about later.
Absolutely, Angela. Why don't you jump on in too? I mean, why is this issue of such importance, and also sort of why are some of the same circles that advocate for justice in every other domain suddenly quiet on the question of Palestine?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, let me say what an honor it is to be with all of you, Marc, Mitchell, Dima, and thank you so much for writing this book. This is precisely the moment when, well, we've needed this book for a long time, but we especially need it right now. Why is the issue of Palestine so critical? Now, first and foremost, because the Palestinians have been struggling against the violent and racist settler colonial strategies of the Israeli government since the State of Israel was founded in 1948. And it seems to me that in the same way we previously described the need to involve people in efforts to bring down the apartheid regime in South Africa, we need to do the same with respect to Israel and Palestine. And another reason is because solidarity with Palestine is indicative of a kind of internationalism that progressive and radical activists, intellectuals, advocates need to be pursuing now in an effort to counter the representation of the U.S. as exceptional. So it's the perfect way to counter what is referred to as American exceptionalism. And understanding the relationship of the U.S. government to Israel helps us to understand a range of domestic issues, including racist police violence, including the militarization of police forces throughout the country. And then finally, I would say the issue is so pivotal because it helps us to recognize the power of ideology. If we ask ourselves, how is it that these people were able to be convinced to storm the Capitol, and how is it that so many Republicans continue to support the person who previously occupied the power of the presidency. It seems to me, by asking how it is that people have been persuaded that the Zionist logic, represents what should be happening in Palestine and Israel. So it helps us to begin to understand how powerful ideology can be, and therefore perhaps to encourage us to develop ways of beginning to dismantle that ideology.
Mitchell, one of the things that, to Angela's point about dismantling this ideology, part of what we have to do is no longer frame an individual person or an individual moment as a kind of outlier. It was very easy in the age of Trump to frame Trump as the boogeyman. And don't get me wrong, there are many ways where he absolutely was, right? I don't want to understate the amount of evil that existed during the Trump presidency. But there's a way that if we frame Trump as exceptional, especially on the question of Palestine, we ignore the fact that there has been bipartisan consensus, or at least indifference, on these issues for so long. I mean, when Trump comes in and moves the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and he recognizes, contravening all sort of norms, international law, conventions, etc., by saying that that Jerusalem is the undivided capital of Israel. When he does that, he's making a very provocative move. But as we say in the book, the Jerusalem Embassy Act was signed in 1995, and Bill Clinton didn't fight it. In many ways, Bill Clinton endorsed these ideas, and every 6 months from 1995 until now, every president, Democrat and Republican, has simply signed a waiver to not move the embassy, but has done nothing to resist the law. And so what Trump did was, Trump didn't actually enact the law. Trump didn't produce the law. He was just the first president to allow the law to move as it was designed for decades. And so when we look at those kinds of moves, when we look at a President Obama, who in many ways seen as the most kind of amenable person to Palestinians since Jimmy Carter, the biggest act of courage we see out of Obama in many ways was just abstaining from a UN vote, not voting to condemn settlement expansion, just not doing anything, not exactly a profile in courage. So when we look at this, there's a way that Trump lets us off the hook, I think. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about the way that Democrats and the way that there's been a kind of bipartisanship on this issue, and how that's also part of the problem with this Palestinian exception?
Yeah, I think it's really, the Jerusalem Embassy Act, that didn't just happen under Bill Clinton's watch. That was massively bipartisan. Which also explains why in the ensuing quarter century, no one, every president signed the waiver, but never wanted to challenge it. There was no possibility of challenging that law because Democrats and Republicans completely agreed on it. How many things can we say that about? And they continued to agree on it year after year after year. And so all Trump did, and I think this was really important, all Trump did was not sign the waiver. He said, I will not waive this law anymore. Therefore, the embassy had to move to Jerusalem. That also makes it much harder to reverse. And it's one of the reasons Joe Biden is absolutely not going to take this on and has made it clear that he will not take this on. But it's not by far not the only example. We can look at, we spend right at the beginning of the book, we talk about how Trump cut off funds to UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which is specifically devoted to supporting Palestinian refugees in the region, including in surrounding countries, but primarily, most of their efforts in the West Bank and Gaza. And that money was just cut off. And again, that was nothing new. Cutting off funds to UNRWA has been bouncing around Congress for many, many years before Trump came along. UNRWA has been a favorite target pro-Israel Democrats and Republicans. It has been a bipartisan bullseye for so many years. So it was hardly surprising that when Trump did this, there was barely a peep on Capitol Hill about it, despite the fact that it's a relatively small amount of money when you consider the U.S. budget, and provides housing, food, education, so much to refugees who have nothing in so many of these camps all throughout the region. It was really an inhuman decision that nobody seemed to mind. And again, it's something that has been there for a long time. It's come up before where the possibility of cutting off funding has been raised. Actually, frequently Israel was the one that objected in some cases, because they recognize that if UNRWA actually does disappear, it's going to be a problem for them. It's going to create a humanitarian crisis. It's going to increase calls for them to actually help to sustain Palestinian refugees, which is something they do not want to do. It has often been Israel itself that stopped that from happening. Now with Netanyahu sounding a very different tone on it, it happened, and it is not an easy thing for Joe Biden to reverse. Although I would say that is one thing that he does seem to be intending to do if he can make it happen. So we can look at a number of examples like this. There was also the move that Trump made to recognize the Golan Heights. This is obviously not an issue of the occupation of Palestinian people, but rather of Syrian people in an area that is undisputably never been a part of Palestine at all. It is undisputably Syrian territory. Israel justifies its occupation of the Golan on security grounds. And actually, we have recently the new Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, saying that, yeah, we understand Israel's security concerns there. He stopped short of actually saying we agree with the recognition, but he also stopped short of saying we're taking it back, which incidentally would not force in any way Israel to abandon the Golan Heights right away. It would simply be standing up for the most basic international principles.
Mitchell, Mitchell, let me ask you a question, Mitchell. Because I mean, how does this happen? I mean, you said, for example, that Biden is willing to refund UNRWA. Mm-hmm. Refunding UNRWA is essentially saying, I will no longer take hospitals, healthcare, and education from Palestinian babies. I mean, mm-hmm. It's such a low bar, right? Saying that we don't necessarily agree with the occupation of the Golan is essentially saying we don't believe in acquisition by force. I mean, since World War I, that's been sort of not cool to do, right? So, I mean, these are very low bars. How is it that we've entered a space where one can look progressive simply by not challenging, or rather by not endorsing the most egregious contraventions of international law or basic human decency?
So I think what we've seen in the Democratic Party is, it's kind of funny. I saw recently, with the acquittal in the Senate of Donald Trump, many people called these Republicans cowards, and they certainly are. I don't think anyone would really argue against that. At the same time, many of the Republicans who voted to acquit Donald Trump were doing what the people who voted for them wanted them to do. So if we're looking for cowardice, I think looking at the Democrats on an issue like UNRWA funding is actually a much better place to look, because this is not something that Democratic voters, for the most part, who know about this, want their representatives to do. They may consider themselves, they may have various views on the conflict and on the occupation even, but for the most part, Democrats do not have a big problem with keeping children from starving or from not being able to go to school. For the most part, Democrats are going to support that. So, you're right. It is a low bar, and it is also a question of who is lobbying them to get them to move very differently. This is a fight with Congress that Biden may have to have, but it's one he's trying to get away from. So this, if we want to talk about cowardice, this is the place that we should be looking, is that Democratic representatives who don't have to do this, who really won't lose votes, at least on an issue like this. They may lose votes on other pieces of Israel-Palestine, but
Absolutely.
not on something like this.
Well, let me pivot to something else. Dima, there's something else that I find really stunning, and we talk about this in the second chapter of the book, on our chapter on criminalizing BDS, of course, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. There is a way, again, that Democrats who are consistently on one side of an issue, on the question of Palestine, do something very different. One of the people we quote, of course, is Cory Booker. He says, this BDS movement is something that I do not support. And of course, that's his right. People can disagree with BDS for tactical reasons. They can disagree for philosophical reasons. There's all sorts of reasons to disagree with BDS. But he says, I think that we should do what we can to protect American companies and other Americans from being attacked in a way that undermines their ability to stand up for what they believe is right. This is just such a bizarre position for a Democrat to stand up against popular boycotts. I mean, can you imagine Cory Booker saying that about Chick-fil-A or Hobby Lobby or Walmart? I mean, I can imagine it in the logic of neoliberal politicians. I mean, but it certainly wouldn't be the stated public position that would be articulated so passionately and unambiguously. Particularly as a legal expert, can you talk a little bit about sort of BDS and again the kind of contortions that we're often doing, not just on the right but on the left, to justify what I estimate as a kind of squelching of free speech? But feel free to frame it how you see it.
Yeah, it's been really astounding to watch this over the last, 5-10 years actually develop. And, when I founded Palestine Legal, there wasn't a single anti-boycott law. And now, 30 states have passed laws that in some way or another punish or condemn boycotts for Palestinian rights. So it's really, it's such a marked force that has made this happen. And, there are many things one can say about how it came to be. But, fundamentally, I think there's there are a few things that have happened. There's I think the book does a lot to kind of bring us to, how in Palestine on the ground, how our politics kind of reacted to the developments on the ground. In the U.S., we've seen the reaction of Israel to the boycott movement over the last 10 years kind of shift from, it has no effect to, oh my God, this is the biggest threat to Israel ever. And that has really activated a huge effort on the part of Israel and on the part of dozens of advocacy groups, Israel advocacy groups here in the US, to oppose specifically the boycott movement, but also any activism for Palestinian rights. And Palestine Legal has documented this enormous wave of anti-democratic, anti-speech suppression of this growing movement for Palestinian rights, which really grew after the Operation Cast Lead, when we saw the enormity of the destruction of Gaza and the how many Palestinians were killed, and so there's been almost complete bipartisan agreement that BDS is bad. And that is because there has been such a complete narrative grip by Israel and the Israel lobby about, the purpose of BDS. about what Palestinians are fighting for and what we're about and why we're engaged in this struggle. And they've managed to frame it as completely, it's on its head, rather than being something that is fighting discrimination, that is fighting for freedom, actually, of the Palestinian people. They have framed it as something that's discriminatory, that is discriminating against Israelis, and they say ultimately Jews as a whole. And so they've managed to vilify it in this way and also create it legally as a discriminatory issue. Right. So these aren't normal boycotts. These aren't actually boycotts for justice. They're boycotts that are, discriminatory and therefore can be punished. Right. And so that's the kind of legal framework that we're working with. And again, it has completely flipped the issue on its head by creating Israel, by making Israel as the victim of this movement, and erasing the motivation of Palestinians, erasing the agency of Palestinians and their allies who are undertaking this as, again, a way to put political pressure on Israel that has, managed to evade all accountability for its violation of international law and human rights. So it's been there are many other ways that this movement has been bombarded with legal and other means to silence it. And one point I think is important is that this is really this is also happening at the same time that we're seeing a lot of other anti-democratic laws being introduced. Right, there are now 60 laws around the country that have been introduced to try to limit protests, and of course the Capitol riots now provide a justification for that, but it was happening before, and they're being pushed by right-wing forces. And so, in the wake of Standing Rock, we saw all of this legislation that was intending to criminalize protests of pipelines and other infrastructure. We've seen in the wake of Ferguson and the uprising a lot of anti-protest bills that are trying to criminalize different forms, different activities that people undertake. So I think it's important to place it also within this broader effort to really undermine our First Amendment rights to associate, to gather, to protest, and to speak out against injustice. So that context, I think, is really important also with this rightward push and this complete undermining of our rights that also goes along with, the domination of money in politics, right? Money is speech, but, you can't get together to protest, right?
Absolutely. It's an interesting thing. And so the calls for BDS themselves are framed as improper, unethical, and sometimes even anti-Semitic. And it's become such a norm to frame it that way that many people don't understand the actual concrete demands of the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, which are three. One is equal treatment, equal rights for Palestinian citizens of Israel. The second is the end to the occupation and return to the 1967 borders. And the third is the right of return for Palestinian refugees as dictated by international law. Those are the three demands. The BDS movement is actually somewhat agnostic on the question of one or two states, although many of us, myself included, advocate one state. It is not a call for violence. In fact, it is a non-violent call, and it's sort of ironic. It reminds me, it's in many ways, to what happens in the United States. And they say, don't protest, don't march, don't sing. If you stood still, they wouldn't shoot you. If you ran, they wouldn't shoot you. If you wear the right clothes, they won't shoot you. And yet we still continue to die. And no matter how we resist, there's a way that it gets criminalized and dismissed. And similarly with BDS, for many people, they said, oh, the Palestinians are violent. Of course, that ignores a very long and deep history of Palestinian nonviolent resistance. But it also creates a certain kind of framework for thinking about how Palestinians should be permitted to resist a settler colonial state that is whose presence itself is violent. Not to mention ongoing and variegated forms of violence against them. But that notwithstanding, this is a nonviolent movement. This is a nonviolent movement, and now people are saying, well, that's a problem too. And then they say, I had one person say to me a few weeks ago, but what about the Palestinian workers who work in these factories? And but boycott, divestment, sanction will take their jobs away. This is a similar argument made in South Africa, right? There's a long there's long and deep history of this. Angela, can you talk a little bit about that? Like how popular resistance, particularly nonviolent popular resistance, can be categorized in this way? I mean, we've seen it in the States, we see it around the world, how governments attack. So I'm thinking about how governments and other forces sort of stop effective movements and some of the tactics they use to undermine them.
Well, absolutely. But at the same time, I think it's really important to point out that there was a kind of moral legitimacy linked to, for example, the boycotts that unfolded during the civil rights era. And likewise also with South Africa. And what's so, almost incredible is the way in which Zionism has transformed, what is the most nonviolent form of resistance imaginable, not only into a major threat, but into anti-Semitism. And I think it's really important to point out the ways in which so many people who might otherwise be supportive of an end to the occupation of Palestine, who might speak out, are afraid because they don't want to be accused of being anti-Semitic. As a matter of fact, a couple of times during my travels abroad, I've been astounded. In Germany, for example, that people who were working with BDS were afraid to include their names in material regarding events because it would expose them to so much violence. And the same thing in Australia. And of course, we know the histories of Germany and Australia with respect to anti-Semitism. But it seems to me that this is, that we shouldn't capitulate to this. This is similar to McCarthyism. This is similar to anti-communism. This is what it reminds me of, the fear that people express that is an explanation for their failure to speak out against the repression in Palestine. I guess I would also say that those of us who have been in support of an end to the occupation for Palestine, some for a few years, some for many, many, many years, I think that we haven't been as serious as we should have been in contesting this equation of support for BDS with anti-Semitism, because now it's running amok with all of the laws that Dima was talking about, with the fact that you were fired from your position at CNN. When I received this award from the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, they retracted it before I had even received it. And that's really dangerous. I think we shouldn't forget our history. We can't forget the damage of anti-communism and McCarthyism. And we're seeing a replay of this kind of mass emotional response. And at the same time, I would say it disarms us with respect to engaging in concrete struggles against anti-Semitism. Especially now, as we see the impact of anti-Semitism on these white supremacists. Well, it's always been that way. I can remember growing up in Birmingham, Alabama, when a church was was bombed, a Black church was bombed, a Jewish synagogue was also bombed. And by failing to contest the ways in which support for Palestinians is equated with anti-Semitism, that means that we don't engage in the kinds of struggles against anti-Semitism that are absolutely necessary at this moment and that need to be connected with the struggle for the human rights of Palestinian people.
Wow. Dima, let me jump to you real quick about that as well, right? Because we're seeing around the country, again, Angela has an award rescinded. I lose a job at a cable news network. But there's also people who have tenured faculty positions. People like Steven Salida, for example, who are effectively fired for having radical oppositional views. These jobs are supposed to be legally protected. What about, I'm thinking about states where people have to sign a waiver saying that they won't support BDS, like in Texas, in order to be employed, for example, as an educator, as a teacher. These seem to be even beyond there's the kind of McCarthyite impulse that we see in what we're describing, but now we're seeing it moved into the law. You know, the Stephen Salidas, the Norman Finkelsteins, all these people who are literally losing their jobs for contesting Israeli policy and practice, for contesting Zionism, for supporting Palestinians, for supporting BDS. What do you make of that? Particularly from, again, I'm appealing to you both as a Palestinian and as a legal, as someone who works in the field of law, because I think these are both incredibly important questions.
Yeah, I think that right now Palestine is really at the forefront of our First Amendment jurisprudence. The discourse about what the First Amendment is, what free speech really means when a public university can fire a tenured professor for something he says on Twitter. It is really testing the boundaries of what our constitutional rights actually mean. And the consequences, I mean, as you were saying, Angela and Mark, and as you both experienced, it goes, there are just hundreds and hundreds of people who we hear from every year who are facing huge consequences, threats to their careers, but also, calls from the FBI trying to investigate them for something they said on Facebook, or, cancellations of Zoom events because Israel and its allies are opposed. The range of suppression of activities and speech that we're seeing are really enormous, and the consequences for individual people is enormous too. And the whole intention is to make it too costly to engage on this issue, right? They've said that, if you watch that Israel lobby documentary that was leaked from Al Jazeera, they said it point blank. This is great. Something like Canary Mission, which profiles people online in a very McCarthyist kind of way, right? It's great. It means that, they're too scared to put their names out there. They're too scared to, they just rather either are silenced or they have to be so busy defending themselves, against these kinds of accusations. So I think it really poses a critical question right now about the bounds of our First Amendment rights. And we see it also evolving in this, especially during this pandemic, when so much is happening online, when these big tech companies are in charge of the public, what has become the public domain, and are actually private companies and can do what they want and censor whatever speech they want. So I think there are a lot of battles that we have to fight. We have to fight the battles in the courts, and there are anti-boycott laws being challenged. And, so far the courts have all decided that, these laws are unconstitutional. Except that, the other battle isn't then in the legislature, because they can just change the law again and, make it applicable in other ways. And that's what's happening in these contexts. And then we have ultimately the battles on the streets and on our campuses. And, that's where the power lies. That's where we have to, that's where we have to insist, not only that we have the First Amendment right to do this, right? It's not just about our free speech rights, but that this is a moral issue. This is a justice issue. This has to be, as the book argues, right, considered as part of our kind of progressive values, and this is the framing that has been pushed down our throats is completely wrong and reversed. So I think there are a lot of ways we need to push back, and ultimately our First Amendment rights are only as much as we fight for, right? And there's a lot of work to do there, because they've been slowly and surely eroded in many ways, and this is doing a lot of damage, the efforts here.
Angela, I want to go to you, then we're going to take some Q&A from the many hundreds of people who are here in the room watching this talk. I'm thinking about two things. One is the amount of solidarity that we see now on this issue. Although things aren't what we want them to be, I just know what it was like to be talking about this question 10 years ago versus now. Even being in the streets of Ferguson until now. I'm also looking at Ilhan Omar. I'm looking at Jamal Bowman, people who have spoken out against the occupation, who have been critical of all sorts of things in ways, not just on the question of Palestine, but on other issues that may have not allowed them to be elected 10 years ago or 20 years ago. I feel like the ball's moving. Even while I deeply disagree with Bernie Sanders' politics on this issue of Palestine, what he and Elizabeth Warren did was still far more than most mainstream Democratic politicians have done ever. And they didn't win, but they didn't lose because of this issue. A politician 20 years ago saying that aid should be withheld based on the treatment of Palestinians in Gaza, I mean, that would have been a non-starter. So I guess what I'm wondering is how hopeful are you that we're moving in the right direction and that we'll eventually be successful?
Well, yeah, that's a complicated question, because yes, I do remember when it was virtually impossible to raise the issue of the occupation of Palestine in the context of other progressive struggles. Of course, there was an enormous amount of work being done around Palestine, but it happened separately. It happened within a political landscape that did not include a whole range of other issues. Or I should say, it was, in a sense, exiled to the peripheries of struggles against racism, the trade union struggles against imperialism. And I can remember, when was it? It must have been perhaps around 2010 or 2011, when a number of us began to talk about how essential it was going to be to create the possibilities for the incorporation of concerns around Palestine on our progressive agendas. So that if we talked about struggles against police crimes, racism in the US, there had to be a way to link it to struggles in solidarity with Palestinian activists. And And so I would say measured in accordance with what was happening then. And that was, a little more than 10 years ago. Come a long way. And sometimes I think it's important to remind ourselves that because, otherwise it feels as if we're conducting the same struggles. We're on a treadmill over and over, and we never make any progress. But the fact that Black student unions all over the country now are standing in solidarity with Palestine is a major victory, because this was not the case 20 years ago. The fact that the Black Lives Matter movement has, especially since the delegation, I think you were on that delegation, Mark. And that would have been, 2014?
Yep, January 2015. Yep, right at the top. 2015
in the aftermath of Ferguson. I mean, I'm so excited that it's been possible to at least alter our political landscape with respect to youth struggles against racism. I don't think there is a Black youth or progressive radical youth organization today that would question the need for solidarity with Palestine. And that represents a lot of work. But it also represents the possibility of change. And if we've been able to do this, then we can, work on people in Congress. And as you say, it would have been unimaginable that someone like Rashida Tlaib could be elected to Congress holding the positions that she holds. Ilhan Omar, despite the fact that they, of course, have also been targeted by the Zionists. But, I do have hope. At the same time, I think we have to be a little bit more serious than we've been. We can't expect these things to happen automatically. And your book is an indication of the way in which we have to kind of up the ante. We have to call out those people who consider themselves progressive or radical, progressive except for Palestine. And we have to point out that if they really want to be a part of the progressive or radical community, they have to reevaluate the ways in which they have allowed Zionist ideology to deflect their attention from one of the most important global issues today.
Absolutely. And in the interest of time, we're going to jump to Q&A. I've never had to actually manage the text, so if something weird happens, y'all can blame me. Let me see. Here we go. Some of these kind of answered in the Q&A, so I'm going to. Mitchell, so the first question I'm going to ask from Mitchell is from Deborah. She said, how do we address the power and influence of Zionists in politics and culture without perpetuating stereotypes and bigotry? So, Mitchell, that's an interesting question, right? How do we deal with this question of lobbies and arrangements without falling into the anti-Semitic narratives and tropes of Jewish cabals of power, et cetera? How do we have that conversation?
So I think there's there's sort of two ways to address that. One is being, I think, uncompromising in opposition to anti-Semitism. And I think that has, in the past, I wouldn't say people have been compromising about it, but I think partially because Jews have been in the United States, as well as a few other places, been perceived as not, sort of anti-Semitism has sort of been done away with. So I think for progressive people have decided, well, this is not a priority. This is not, and where they have encountered it, it's been used in this cynical fashion to cover for Israeli crimes and similar issues, similar things like that. So I think right now, it's important to be uncompromising and very clear about opposition to real anti-Semitism. I think that's one part of it. I think another part, and this part I think falls more on Jews like myself than anyone else, is being very, very clear and strong about calling out the, unfortunately, many, many instances where anti-Semitism is either being collapsed with anti-Zionism, which is completely illegitimate, or is being cynically, the accusation of anti-Semitism is being cynically hurled to distract the conversation, to cover for or excuse Israeli policies, whatever it may be. So I think that's one track where we need to do that. The other is, I think, really simple. One of the biggest problems, and this has been something that advocates for Palestinian rights have said, who work in Washington, have said for years and years and years, and it seems to fall on deaf ears. We go in, and whether it's me, many people I know go into congressional offices or to the White House staff, to State Department, and we talk to people who might, who are in general sympathetic. And they say, look, the fact of the matter is my boss doesn't want to hear this. And I say, why? And the answer is, well, he gets 30 phone calls a day from people telling him, from his constituents, telling him or her why they should support Israel in this, that, or the other. And they're not hearing from supporters of Palestinian rights. That has started to change in recent years. So that's one part of it. There's also a real need for like lobbying organizations, the things that for the most part progressives and people on the left really don't like, think tanks and other, that sort of nonprofit machine. It is ceding that ground to pro-Likud, pro-occupation forces has not served well. So I think if we're just looking at that part of the issue, that's how we address that. More culturally, how do we avoid being labeled anti-Semite? Well, look, you can't avoid it. You have to be willing to take it on. That is something that it's going to happen. I'm Jewish. I get called an anti-Semite all the time. I get called a self-hating Jew. I get called a capo. I get called, even things that are worse. Two professors right here who have lost awards or jobs because of standing up for Palestine. We have to be willing to suffer the slings and arrows, and we can't. It can't just be a safe space. It's going to be a dangerous space until we really turn this around, so that it is so that we expose the absurdity of the stance that supporting Palestinian rights is somehow anti-Semitic.
Right.
That is partially the job of Jews to do, and groups like I'm so proud of what Jewish Voice for Peace has done over the years in this regard. I think they've really impacted the discourse, and newer group like If Not Now is doing similar work. That's great, but in the meanwhile, people, whether Jewish or not, have to be willing to fight this. We cannot. It does suck. I know it sucks. It sucks when I go out and I do anti-racist work, and somebody, tries to tell me that I'm an anti-white racist or whether I can laugh that off. But if somebody, if people are called anti-Semites, then that sounds horrible. That feels terrible. It feels terrible to me, even though I've been the victim of anti-Semitic violence in my life. And so, but we have to be willing to do that. When we look at civil rights struggles, when we look at the history of suffragists, when we look at, my God, LGBTQIA struggles, all the people were willing to be killed. And yeah, it sucks to lose a job. I know, Mark, it sucks to lose a job. It sucks to have an award taken away, Professor Davis. And it sucks to just be called an anti-Semite. It hurts. I know. I mean, I've spent enough time with you, Mark, watching and seeing how much this hurts you. when you have to, and you have to keep going. That's just what it is. And there's a part of us, and we need to help our fellow activists. We each, I try really, really hard to support particularly non-Jews who are called anti-Semites. And I don't expect that to just bounce off your backs. I don't. I think I need to be there for you. That's what I think. And I think we all, on the one hand, we need to be able to endure it ourselves, and we need to support each other in doing it. We can change it. It can be changed. But for a while, we have to be able to take it. And if we do that, then it has a lot less power over us. If we're not backing down because we're called an anti-Semite when it's not true, and if we reinforce that by indeed calling out real anti-Semitism, I have not seen a whole lot of it, frankly, in the Palestinian solidarity movement. I have seen it on occasion. And we've seen groups like the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights and Jewish Voice of Peace and other groups call out anti-Semitism among, Ali Abunimo wrote a wonderful thing about 10 years ago, I think, calling out a particular case of anti-Semitism among Palestine solidarity and expanding that to saying nobody can do this. Being strong and doing all of these things, that's how we fight it. That's how we turn it around. And that's how we end up turning it into an absurd accusation.
Absolutely. Okay. I'm going to jump, and we have about 10 minutes left. We're going to move very quickly. We're going to move through the questions a little more quickly. I know there's a couple more here. I apologize for not pulling them up faster. Whoops, I think I hit the wrong button there. I'll bring Mitchell back in. Sorry, Mitchell, it's not because you're a Nets fan. Give me 1 second. And I think there was one person we were going to bring in who had a question. Lisa Turner. Let's see. We said we'd bring her up for a question. Lisa, are you there? Are you there, Lisa? It's me, Mark. Judy Blume humor there for those of you old enough to remember. Hey, Lisa.
Hi, how are you all?
Great. You had a question.
Yes, I am late to my own identity as an activist, 48 years old, but the summer of 2020 was my 1968, Dr. Davis. And my discovery this summer was how how embodied protest is, and how I think as a younger person, I was taught to work with the mind. Later, I learned with students, I'm a teacher, you can't work with the mind without also connecting with people emotionally. But using the body as a tool for protest came to me much, much later. And I kind of tested that out this summer. I was wondering if you would be willing to speak in any way to your embodied life as an activist and protester, and how that has shifted for you over time.
Well, okay. Well, thank you for the question, Lisa. And I think I'm going to use your question as an occasion to point out that that I first became aware of the importance of standing with my Palestinian comrades and sisters and brothers when I was in college. And I attended college at Brandeis University. So people might think that it's kind of interesting that my first encounter with Palestine solidarity was at a Jewish university with my Jewish friends. And not very long ago, I spoke at Brandeis on the occasion of, I think, the 50th anniversary of a major demonstration that took place on the campus at Brandeis. And I, of course, there especially, it was important to talk about the need to incorporate campaigns for solidarity with Palestinian people into our activist frame. And, I went there expecting to be really attacked, criticized. I had my hackles up, but I was really so surprised that we had a very interesting conversation, especially about the role of Jews. And I talked to some people afterwards who said that was really the first time that they had taken seriously the prospect of speaking out against the occupation of Palestine. So I guess that's embodied to a certain extent. I mean, I think my activism has always been embodied because it came to me, not in the form of an epiphany that this is what I need to do, but as a way of living. Growing up in Birmingham, Alabama, and challenging, having to challenge the racial segregation and the violence, the bombs, the dynamites, and so forth. Having to learn that was not supposed to be normal, that could, in fact, imagine a different world. But having said that, perhaps I can speak about the fact that when that award, that Human Rights, Fred Shuttlesworth Human Rights Award, was retracted, it was really a crushing experience for me. Not because I'm not willing to stand up for what I believe, but because I had a special relationship with the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. My mother, helped to build that organization. She was a volunteer. My Sunday school teacher was the one who actually created the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. And by the way, she was totally opposed to what the Board of Trustees did when they disinvited me. And she's still there, and she's still struggling. But what I learned was that that was an important wake-up call. And people in Birmingham, Black people, but also Jewish people, spoke out against the steps that the Institute had taken. And as a matter of fact, now they have completely transformed the leadership of the Institute. And by the way, I did get the award, Mitchell. They gave it to me. But the fact that they were able to rethink the mission of the Institute and to recognize that how their approach was in effect to acknowledge the human rights of everyone except the Palestinians. So now I think we see a new kind of consciousness in the larger community as well as the Institute. So I'm glad that happened. Although it didn't feel good at the time, but it was an important turning point, I believe. And I can tell you that I received messages from people all over the country and all over the world who were in opposition to the steps that the Board of Trustees at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute had taken. So that was an important struggle. But let me just say finally on this question of embodiment, that I totally agree with you that movements are embodied, and that it is important for us to recognize that we are not individuals, that we are a part of larger bodies, so to speak. And demonstrations such as the ones you attended this past summer help us to feel our connectedness with others, help us to experience ourselves as members of a community, as opposed to an individual who is powerless, and particularly given the impact of capitalism. And I don't know, is this the first time we've said the word?
It might be.
Because we always have to point out that the elephant in the room is capitalism, and because of the ways in which individualism is so linked to the theories and practices of capitalism, we always have to figure out how to challenge that, and we do it. Particularly at those moments, as John Berger pointed out, when we participate in demonstrations, which become he called them rehearsals for revolution. So, thank you, Lisa. Thank you so much for your work.
Mark, no, let me see here. It says, Mark, you have, just from Jason Nolan, Mark, you have suffered professionally for your advocacy for Palestine. It is one of the things, okay, let me skip that part. Can you speak a bit about vaccine justice and Israel's blatant disregard for Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, and why that part of the COVID story has been largely unreported? So far, Israelis have gotten the vaccine at a higher proportion, a higher rate than any state, any country in the world. It's actually sort of extraordinary how much they have been able to do that. But when they say Israelis have gotten it, they are referring quite literally to people who live inside of the state of Israel and who have Israeli citizenship. It does not include those people living in the West Bank. It does not include those living in Gaza. There are some people in East Jerusalem, to my knowledge, who have gotten it, despite having permanent residency and not having, obviously, citizenship. There are multiple problems with this. Obviously, at the ethical and humane level, to not grant people access to vaccines is inhumane. It's unethical. It's unthinkable to me. But it's also illegal. It also violates international law. I think 5,000 vaccines were given as recently as a week ago, which is an infinitesimal number in relation to the number of people living under occupation. The Israeli government will say it's not our job to do that. It's the Palestinians' job to do that. And it's very interesting how at moments when it's convenient, they will say Palestinians run themselves. They can handle this. They're a state. And then any other moment, they'll say Palestinians are not a state. They'll say that the Oslo Accords have made it, since the Oslo Accords, Palestinians are responsible for their own health. We know that the West Bank right now is controlled, I believe 62% of the West Bank is controlled by Israelis, even at this very moment. And Gaza, despite Israel having left in 2005, is still controlled by air, land, sea, population registry, etc., by the Israeli government. It's still under occupation. And we understand that an occupied people are supposed to be granted access to these things, specifically health-related issues, and specifically vaccines. I mean, it's fairly clear. The Geneva Conventions also suggest this or demand this. And so there's absolutely no way that we can justify not granting people access, and it just doesn't make sense. Whether you have a Hawiyah, whether you have a Israeli passport, no matter what you have, if you got COVID and I'm sitting next to you, I'm going to get COVID. And so the idea of not granting these vaccines, to me, makes very little sense. We have time for one more question, and then we have to go.
Mark, I just want to jump in really quickly, just to mention one thing about that, which is that Yara Asi at the Arab Center in Washington has done some wonderful work exposing the fact that the Oslo Accords actually don't say that Israel is not responsible for vaccinating Palestinians. They say that Palestinians are responsible for sort of normal vaccinations, rubella, mumps, the sort of things we all get when we're kids. But something extraordinary like this is actually specifically not covered. And it says so in the Oslo Accords. Nobody, reads all the appendices. Yara Asi, as I said, has done this really great work, and people should find her on Twitter because she tweeted about it. That's where you can find, and you can, I'm sure, contact her and ask her about it for more information.
Absolutely. And there's a wonderful book, Peace and Its Discontents, which gets at many of the sort of holes in the Oslo Accords, which, by the way, were not designed to be enforced right now in 2021 when they were created in 1993. So there's a million reasons why that doesn't make sense. Evan says, until recently, referring to Israel as an apartheid state was controversial in the mainstream. Do you think the recent statement by B'Tselem declaring Israel an apartheid state is somewhat of a watershed moment for the conversation around Palestine in the Democratic Party and general U.S. media? Will it push the mainstream left to take a more progressive platform, Palestine platform, to actually affect change? I want to say a little bit about that, and then Dima, I'm going to give you the last word. First of all, the fact that, the B'Tselem report was important, but this is what Palestinians have been saying for a very long time. And the fact that it takes for B'Tselem to release the report for people to finally hear this is somewhat disturbing. I found it interesting that CNN even tweeted the B'Tselem report about Israel being an apartheid state. It's just a little delicious irony for me. But the idea that Israel is an apartheid state is something that has been challenged. It's something that has been critiqued for a long time, but with very little grounds. To be an apartheid state, you do not have to mirror apartheid South Africa. You do not have to be the exact same conditions or dynamics of apartheid South Africa. But what you do need is a system of inequality around these questions of race, gender, religion, identity, etc. And if you just look inside of the state of Israel, Palestinians are if you go to the website for idala.org, you'll see more than 60 laws that are in place right now that reflect an unequal treatment for Palestinian citizens of Israel, right? Because often Israel will say, well, we treat all our citizens the same, ignoring everyone in the West Bank, ignoring people under occupation, ignoring people who've been denied the right of return, who live in exile. But even if you just focus on inside of 48, you're still talking about inequality, from Nakba laws to admissions committees in places like the Galilee. You can see this. So there's that. We need to be able to hold on to that language, not just for organizing and movement building, but also for intellectual and juridical accuracy. And when we extend that to other parts of the of historic Palestine, we see that. Someone asked what the website was. It's idala.org, ADALAH.org. But Dima, I'd like you to just say a little bit more about sort of the language itself, right? I mean, apartheid, people often say is impermissible. There's a move on Facebook right now to stop people from to consider Zionism to be a critique of Zionism to be seen as unacceptable on Facebook. You can't criticize Zionism, challenge Zionism; it's seen as a slur. So if you can't, so apartheid, Zionism, settler colonialism. This is all language that people say can no longer be used. What does it mean for the discourse to be policed in this way?
The policing, as you say, is happening across the board. Whatever we call it, it is somehow beyond the pale, unacceptable. But part of why it's so important, I think, is because apartheid and words like segregation, they really clarify what's going on here and what the heart of the problem is, which is a complete unequal treatment of an entire people, and the privileging of one people over another, for their right to self-determination, for their right to live in and for their right to have peace and security, right? And so really our ability to own these terms and to define what Palestinians actually experience and live every day is really critical. And I think this is one of the points, this really strong points of the book, is that we have a lot of work to do to prioritize the needs and the narratives and the experiences of Palestinians here. We on their own terms and not on Israeli terms. It's not just about whether what Palestinians, the rights that Palestinians get are good for Israelis. It's we need our freedom and our rights in order for Israelis and Jews and everybody to achieve a kind of equal rights and equality. And so I think the language is critical, and what the B'Tselem report and generally the discourse is increasingly utilizing these words, and this is part of the shift, right? I mean, there are studies that have shown, like, the word Palestine was hardly used, in the media, whatever, years ago, and today you're seeing more and more use of these terms to define the issue. So I think legally we're not there. Perhaps there's going to be an ICC. There's movement in the ICC. Perhaps we're seeing eventually there could be accountability legally. But the way we define it, the way we talk about it, the way we really understand the lived realities of Palestinians is what this is about. It's the narrative. It's how what we understand the Palestinian struggle to be, really.
Absolutely, and I hope that there is that accountability. Although the ICC tends to only, it seems like it's Africa that seems to be largely targeted by the ICC in reality. But I think you're right that the work needs to continue. We have to hold each other accountable. Those of us who identify positions on the left of any sort have to no longer allow Palestine, among other issues, to be exceptions. Instead, we must stand in solidarity, and we must fight, and we must struggle. And family, that is why Mitchell and I wrote this book, Except for Palestine: The Limits of Progressive Politics. We hope you read it. We hope you engage it. We hope you critique it. I see critiques in the comments. Those are great too. We want to be challenged. We want to be pressed. But we want this to be a book that at least brings or further brings Palestine into the conversation, into a mainstream conversation. And so we do ask people to support the book to the best extent that you can. This book has not gotten the type of mainstream reviews that we would have hoped or would have expected. It's the first book I've written that hasn't been reviewed by Publishers Weekly. That's a first world problem, but it does reflect the way that the controversy around Palestine has made some people just not want to engage it. And we have to engage it. We have to talk about it. We have to amplify the conversation, and if we want to ultimately get not just rights, but freedom, justice, safety, and self-determination for the Palestinian people and for all people, but especially for the Palestinians when it comes to this conversation we're having today. Thank you all for joining me. Mitchell and I are so excited and so proud of what we've been able to do with the help of community, with the help of so many people who have supported us with this book, who have given us resources, archives, references, gentle and tough critiques. We're grateful. Dima Khalidi, thank you for always being an advocate. You've been there since day one, and Palestine Legal's been there since day one. Of course, Angela, thank you so much for being a friend and ally, a comrade, a colleague, all the things, and for joining us for this event as well.
Let me add my thanks to both of you as well.
Thank you all for writing this, and it's an honor.
Yeah, thank you so much for the book. Absolutely.
Thank you. Everybody, the book is called Except for Palestine. We, of course, I as a bookstore owner, I'd love for you to buy the book, not because I'm going to make any money off of it, but because I'd rather you not buy it from Amazon. So feel free to click the link right there, Except for Palestine. If for some reason you don't like my store, that's okay. Go to bookshop.org, go to Politics and Prose, go to Mahogany Books, go to Lit Bar. Get the book from an independent bookstore if you can, so we can support and live out some more of our politics. But if you want, you can click that little green button at the bottom and you'll be all right in a few seconds. You can get that book right there. But thank you all. Have a good night. Peace.